Chapter 5. Bede Dennis stumbled in the darkness. His feet grated on the pavement. God damn it, he thought. I'm drunk. Stone motherless, crawling drunk. A man's feet won't go where he wants 'em to. His hands slid along a glass-windowed shop front, clutched at a veranda post. He clung to it, swaying. Behind him his brother cursed at the unlighted blackness. Bede pushed away from the post. "Shut ya stupid mouth," he grunted, "or you'll wake the flamin' dead." Dan slewed past in the darkness. His shoulder brushed Bede's. They staggered abreast of each other. The lights of the Rond Hotel stabbed out ahead. Dan reeled against a wall. "To hell with the flamin' dead," he slobbered. "And that goes for you, too." Bede jerked out a fist. His fingers closed on Dan's shirt. He swung his brother round. "Listen," he hissed, "and don't be a bloody fool. You're drunk, and so am I, but it don't make any difference. We've got a little job to do." He pushed Dan away. "Keep movin' and don't open ya trap. We want to get past them winders without bein' seen." Dan tucked in his shirt. His feet splayed in uncertain steps. The bastard, he thought, he can't keep his hands to himself. He has to be mauling someone. Brother or no brother. One of these days I'll beat his bloody brains out. He felt Bede's hand on his arm. Again. "Listen," Bede whispered. "Come out in the road. There's a fair mob inside there." They angled off the pavement. Dan tripped on the curb. Bede hauled him up. "For crying out loud," he grunted. "Stay on ya useless feet." On the dusty arc of the roadway, they reeled past the Rond. Light flowed from the windows. Voices droned through the door. Bede pulled on Dan's arm. "All right," he whispered. "Here's the corner. We'll get down here to the yard." They again groped in darkness. The Rond's side windows were unlighted. Pitch shadows clung to the rough-bricked wall. Bede touched it with his left hand. Let the fingers slide along. When they rubbed on timber, he stopped. "The gate's somewhere about here," he whispered. His hand moved along, felt the handle of a catch. "I've got it," he added. Bede crept through first, into the hotel yard. Dan followed. Bede left the door open. "That way we'll play it safe," he thought. "A man can get out in a hurry if he wants to." They felt their way past the motor shed, where the electric light plant droned, then across to a row of stables. The first 3 or 4 had their fronts removed. Inside them cars smelt strongly of petrol. Bede bumped into an open half-door. He rested his hand on it. "This ought to do us," he whispered. "He keeps his nag in the end stall. He's got to come past us here to get to it." Dan rested his back against a stable wall, close to Bede. They waited in the darkness, each listening to the other's heavy breathing. Bede pulled a bottle from his hip pocket. "You better take a nip," he hissed. "Pull your guts together for a bit." He nudged Dan's arm with the bottle. Dan clutched at it. He had the bottle halfway to his mouth when he said, "It ain't mine you want. To worry about not sticking together. Maybe ya own might spring a leak." Bede swore softly and viciously. His hands clawed the bottle away from Dan and upended it into his own mouth. He felt the bottle neck rattle against his teeth. God, he thought, a man's hands are shaken. I could drive the bottle into his skull. Dan sensed his brother's thoughts. He eased away along the wall. No, you don't, he grunted. You don't get cloutin' me. Bede lowered the bottle. He wiped his mouth, then rammed the cork tight into the bottle. He hefted it in his hand. "You was lucky I kept my temper," he grated. "Another second, and I'd have split ya hair, parted it right down the middle." Dan's eyes stared intently in the darkness. A man's got to watch him, he thought. He's working himself up, getting set to bash hard and fast. Dan spat into the open stable. "You're mad," he said, "mad as a bloody snake." Bede hefted the bottle again, slopping the wine around inside. He balanced on the balls of his feet. "Maybe I am," he whispered, "but don't ever say I ain't got any guts." They waited, staring into the hot night blackness, each with his thoughts of the other. A horse nickered in its stall, its hooves stamped, and the dung packed on the dun-packed floor. Bede pressed in close to the wall, felt his brother's arm. "That's it," he whispered. "That's his bloody horse. He won't be long now." Dan shuddered in the darkness. Suddenly he felt sober, stone-cold, motherless sober. Fear crawled in his mind. Sweat clung to the palms of his hands. "Let's get out of it," he choked. "It ain't worth the risk." A man might swing for a few lousy quid. He started across the yard, but Bede's hand viced down on his shoulder, spun him round, and slammed his body against the wall. "Who's yeller now?" Bede grated. "You're crawlin' out of it like a dingo dog." The door behind the Rond Hotel opened. A shaft of light speared the darkness as a man came out. He turned to shut the door. Blackness blotted out the yard again. Bill Bates rolled slowly towards the stables, singing under his breath. Behind the brothers the horse whinnied loudly. Its feet drummed in a dancing beat. Now only a few yards away, Bill Bates chuckled to himself. "God damn it," he thought, "that old horse knows as much as I do." Likes his tucker as regular as clockwork. Bill reached the paved stable forecourt. His unsure feet stumbled over a raised brick curbing. "The hell," he grunted. "I should have remembered that. A man must be drunk." He chuckled again, rumbling it deep down in his belly. His hat had tipped back. He slid it off his head and rifled work-blunted fingers through his sweaty hair. "Take a bit of a breather," he went on. The hot night blanketed him. What did it matter if there was no one to listen? A man talks to himself a lot in the back country, gets used to it in the loneliness of camp life. Bill scratched his head and listened to the horse nicker impatiently. "I'm comin', son," he chuckled. "You're gonna get ya feed. I'm just coolin' off a bit first." He shuffled on the paved forecourt, pushing one foot ahead of the other. His heavy breathing almost reeked into Bede's face. Dan crouched, pressed tight to the wall. Bill stopped again. "She's dark all right," he said out loud. "A man can't see a bloody thing." He inched another foot forward. That flamin' door ought to be about here somewhere. His hands groped out, feeling for the remembered door latch. They pawed in the air, then rested on Bede's shirt front, shifted up to his neck. Bill felt his own neck bristle. A wave of icy fear washed down his spine. His voice choked in his throat. "God Almighty," he croaked. "What's that? Who's that standin' there?" Betty brushed the big hands away, heard them flap limply down onto the old man's trousers. The old sod's frightened, Betty thought. Scared him out of his wits. He'd be a bloody sight more scared if he knew what was coming to him. Betty tightened his fingers round the bottle. "It ain't no one, Bill," he whispered. "Only me and my brother Dan." Bill shivered with a dead coldness. Movement drained from his limbs. He wanted to run, but something made him stay. The bastards, he thought. The dirty, crawling bastards. They've been waiting on a man. To hell with them. I'll see 'em there first, before I'll run. He felt the blood pulse back in his body, the strength come back to his hands. "You pick a funny place," he grunted, "to hang around. Why don't you beat it into the pub?" The darkness hid Bidet's head shake. He rubbed the bottle on his leg, felt its cold smoothness on the trousered flesh. "We like it here," he whispered. "Don't we, Dan?" Dan tried to speak, but his tongue clung to his mouth. The spittle had caked into scum. He pushed away from the wall as Betty prodded him with the bottle. "Ain't that so, Dan?" Betty whispered. "Or didn't you hear me?" Before Dan could use his voice, the horse nickered insistently. Bill shoved up against Betty, pushing him to one side. Bill groped on the stable door. "Out of my bloody way," he grunted. "I'm sick of the pair of you." He heard the whoosh of the bottle and tried to dodge it. The dirty, he thought, and felt the smash of splintered glass. Blood splattered down into his eye. "Oh, Christ," he groaned. For a long moment his heavy body fought to stay on its feet. Betty smashed with the broken bottle. Bill's body slumped in the darkness and folded onto the brickwork. Betty kicked out viciously. "That's him," he grunted, "and one for his bloody knob. Now we'll see how much dough he's got on him." Betty slid his hands over the body's heavy paunch. His fingers prodded over the lifeless rump and found the hip pocket. He jerked out the roll of notes. "Got it," he said, "and it's all here, big as a drum." Dan staggered towards the open half door. His hands clutched at it, holding up his body. He heard his brother's voice. The whisper came to him from a well of darkness. "God," he thought, "he's my brother, the dirty, crawling mongrel. He's killed old Bill. A man doesn't need light to look down there. Old Bill's eyes'll be staring up at the sky. The color'll be gone from his face." Dan hung his head over the half door. He started to spew. Betty slammed out a hand in the blackness. He spun his brother round. "For crying out loud," he grated, "you've got no guts, all right. Give a hand to drag 'em in here." He pulled back the half door. Dan retched while he helped Betty. They pulled the heavy body inch by inch across the forecourt, then dragged it into the empty stall. Betty softly closed the half door. His hands fumbled along the wall for the top half. He closed that too. "She's right," he whispered, "as right as rain. They ain't no one gonna find him till the mornin'." He jerked Dan's arm. "Come on, and let's get out of it. They ain't a soul knows we came in here." They felt their way towards the entrance, to the little gate Betty had left unlatched. The horse nickered shrilly, stamping round in its stall. The hoof lashed out in anger. The brothers heard the thud. Bede cursed under his breath. "Shut up, you bastard," he hissed. "A man ought to have done you too." He found the gate, and they went through. Bede closed it after Dan. Silent in the dust, they padded down the side street. Their minds were sober clear. Their feet trod carefully. Smothered in the darkness, they left the Ronde behind them. "Well, go down here," Bede whispered. "Then swing round towards the river. Head for Molly's place." God damn him to hell, Dan thought. He's not human. A snake has more feeling. He bumped into Bede's shoulder, then pushed away from him. A dog barked behind one of the houses. Dan shuddered involuntarily. "You was a bloody fool," he said. "You needn't have killed You could have just rapped him for his roll." "The hell I could," Bede grunted. "I didn't know he was going to paw a man." He spat hissingly. Dan felt sick again. He wanted to spew. The muscles were balled in his stomach. "You could have kept your mouth shut," he choked, "but you didn't want to. You wanted him to know it was you, so that you could do him." Bede chuckled softly. "Maybe you're right," he said. "And what if I did? He's dead now, and there ain't no sense in belly aching about it." Dan strained against the sickness. It was tight in his chest, wanting to spew out of his mouth. But he could only retch dryly. When he could speak, he said, "By the living hell, this the is. If they string us up by the neck, you'll see some sense in it." Bede padded on silently. The smell of the river was getting stronger. He still had the bottle neck clutched in his hand. "They ain't no one gonna string us up by the neck," he grunted. "They ain't no way of getting any proof. No one saw us around there." "What about fingerprints and things like that?" Dan felt better now. The sickness was leaving him. "The sergeant's a pretty fly bird." Bede grinned, stony-faced, in the darkness. "The dingo," he thought. "The lousy, yellow-bellied dingo. He spews out his guts because he's frightened. Then he comes crawling round for the money. The only fingerprints, he said, are on this bottle neck. And when we gets to the bridge, I'm going to toss it in the river. The mud'll bury it." Dan bumped into Bede. They padded shoulder to shoulder. "The hell," Dan thought. "Why should I worry?" Old Bill had it coming to him. That was a big wad he was carrying. He should have stuck with us instead of teaming up with Rick and his crowd. Dan shoved out a hand. It rested on Bede's steel-hard arm. "A man's got to pass it to you," he said. "You don't miss many tricks." Bede shook off the hand. "No," he said softly, "and you don't want to either. The first one you miss'll be ya last. I ain't puttin' any trust in ya." Their feet grated on the steel bridge. The stagnant water whispered underneath. Bede stopped in the middle of the span and flung the bottleneck over the high side. They heard it clunk in the water. "She's right there," Bede grunted. "The mud goes down for 20 feet. Their heels echoed hollowly until they again scuffed in dust. Bede turned sharp left, feeling carefully with his feet. "God damn it," he whispered. "It's dark. A man'll fall in the river if he don't watch his step." "Watch his step is right," Dan grunted. He bumped past Bede and scuffed his feet slowly. He felt the trampled depression of a track under his feet. "I got better eyes in the dark than you. Just stick close to my tail." They padded slowly in the darkness. Their feet followed a path trodden ankle-deep in the dust, under a giant gum tree. Dan stubbed his boot on a root. He stumbled forward, and Betty cracked into his back. They sprawled in the dust, cursing the night's pitch blackness. Betty scrambled to his feet. "Get out of the bloody way," he cursed, "and let me go first. I don't know why I bother with ya." The track wound for another half-mile before they heard a dog bark, suddenly ahead of them. Its chain rattled as it shook its body. Dan spat towards his feet. "That's Molly's dog," he said. "We ain't got too far now." They walked on. The dog's barking grew more excited. "I've been thinking," Dan added, "about that doe. I reckon we ought to hide it somewhere. If the Johns find it on ya, you're gone for sure." Betty slid a hand round to his hip, felt the bulge strained tight in the pocket. "Maybe you're right at that," he grunted, "but where can a man put it at this hour of bloody night?" Dan reached out for Betty's arm. They stopped in the darkness. "Listen," Dan whispered. "The track we're on is the one closest to the river, ain't it? The one Molly drives her cattle along when she's helpin' drovers over the bridge." Betty tried to see his brother's face in the darkness. "The hell," he thought, "what's he up to now? He's got some scheme on to twist a man. That's a lot of dough to leave around." He rested a hand on his hip. "Yeah," he grunted, "that's right. But what about it?" Dan pushed past Betty. "This," he said, "if I've got my bearings right from the sound of that dog, there ought to be a big gum tree somewhere about here." "For crying out loud," Betty said, "there's a whole flamin' forest of 'em." "Yeah, but this one's different." Dan felt with his hands at the base of a tree. "It's got a knobby butt at the bottom, and halfway up its trunk there's a dead limb spout. I remember gettin' a gallah's nest out of it when we was kids. I've often noticed it since then when I've been ridin' past. A tree spouts the hell of a place to put 400 quid. Betty stared towards Dan in the blackness. "Is that one it?" "No." Dan moved uncertainly to another tree. His hands clawed round the butt. "But this one is." "I thought I wasn't too far out." Betty inched forward slowly until he was close to Dan. He felt the knobby bulge in the bark. "She's knobby all right," he said softly. "How far up's the spout?" "Not too far," Dan said. "It's just above this knob. If I get up on your shoulders, I can reach nicely to shove the wad in." Betty fingered the notes in his pocket. "God damn it," he thought, "a man's taking a chance. 400 quid tucked into a stinking gallah's nest. Can you beat it?" He pulled out the notes. "All right," he said, "but it's only for a day or two. We'll come back in a couple of nights and get 'em." "Sure," Dan chuckled. "These a lot of things a man can do with a roll that size." "Yeah, well, cut out the bloody cacklin'." Betty stuffed the notes into Dan's hands. "And get up on my shoulders. I'm hoggin' for a drink. The sooner we get to Molly's shack, the better." "You're right at that," Dan said. Betty bent over and Dan straddled his neck. When he straightened up, Betty braced his hands on the tree trunk. Dan wriggled to a kneeling, then a standing position. Betty grunted under the weight of the boots. biting into his shoulders. "Goddamn you to hell," he grunted, "and hurry up. Your boots are cutting the arms off me." They swayed in the darkness. Dan groped around, above his head, his fingers clamped on the dead wood spout. He steadied himself for a moment. "She's right," he panted. "I've got her." He pushed the notes inside. "You can let a man down now." Betty braced his legs for the strain. He felt one of Dan's boots biting deeper as Dan eased down onto a knee. "And don't mark the bark," Betty grunted. "The Johns' black trackers have got eyes like flamin' hawks." Dan knelt on Betty's shoulders, then slid down to the ground. The brothers stood close in the darkness. Betty rubbed his shoulders. "I ain't marked her," Dan said. "I thought of that when I went up." "So long as you ain't," Betty told him. Their feet again found the track. Their boots scuffed in the dust. Ahead of them the dog growled savagely. They heard it snap on the end of its chain. From its frantic snarls the dog sounded as if it was choking. Then an oblong of yellow lantern light glowed softly. A woman stood outlined in a doorway. She was naked, with a towel held draped round her middle. "God damn ya to crawl in hell," she screamed at the dog. "If I come out there, I'll strangle ya." The dog ceased its fierce growling and whimpered softly. Dan spat through his teeth. "How are you there, Molly?" he called. "You got company." "Me and Betty's called in for a session." The woman bent over to peer into the darkness. She put a hand up to her eyes. "For flogging a team in a sand bog," she said. "Who the hell's that? And what are you doing at this hour of the night?" The brothers walked up close to her. Betty pinched her on the arm. Dan tried to pull the towel away. "You must be slippin', Molly," he chuckled. "I thought you'd know me voice anywhere." Molly brushed a tangle of hair from her face. She stepped back inside the door, patting silently on bare feet. "Come on in, for Johnny's sake," she said. "A woman'll get her death out here." "She would at that," Dan said. He shut the door behind him. Betty went over to sit on the bed. Dan leaned against the wall. The woman stared from one to the other. Her eyes sized them both up. "These something ain't right," she said, "with you too. I can smell it on ya." She tucked the towel skirt-wise on her hips. "Come on, out with it, and don't splatter any crap." "There's nothin' that ain't right," Betty said softly. He stretched out his legs in front of him. "And the ain't nothin' for you to know, except one thing." He suddenly lurched up to jerk her to him, flattening her breast against his chest. "And that is, we've been here since 7 o'clock this evenin'. Got that? 7 o'clock this evenin'." Molly twisted her body out of his arms. Her hands fumbled after the towel as it slid to the floor. She stamped a foot on it and thumped a fist into Betty's ribs. "Keep your bloody hands off me," she flared, "or I'll claw your eyes. They ain't no man can tell me what I've got to do." Dan pushed away from the wall. "Can you beat it?" he thought. "She's as naked as a billiard ball, and Betty's fighting with her." He picked up the towel. "Shove this round your rump," he said, "and listen to some reason. Don't get so sweaty under the saddle. Betty's just trying to ask you for a favor." "The hell I am," Betty grunted. Molly snatched the towel and waved it in his face. "You damn well better be," she said, "or get out of my flamin' place. You can please yourself." Dan slid an arm round her shoulders. His other hand helped her to tuck in the towel. He patted her softly on the stomach. "Listen, Molly," he said. "You've known us for a long time. If Betty ain't askin' you for a favor, I am. If anyone ever asks you, will you say, we've been here since 7? Molly unhooked a shirt from the wall and pulled it over her head. She brushed the hair back from her eyes. "That's all right, Dan," she nodded. "I don't lap up any cream, but I can listen to some sense." She jerked a thumb at Betty. "That's something this mangy sod never had." Betty slapped her on the behind. "A man ought to flatten ya," he chuckled, "but it ain't worth the risk." He sat down on the bed. "A man might wake up with his throat cut." "Yeah," Dan said, "and that might help to keep his mouth shut." He watched Molly button the shirt. Her breast strained it out in the front. "What's it to be, Molly? Are you gonna ride along with us if any one asks ya?" Molly unwound the towel and rewound it round her shirt tails. She padded across the floor to a small door, set in the part canvas, part timber wall. One hand jerked the door open, the other clung to the towel tuck. "Maybe I am," she said. "We'll see how it goes. I've got a mate in here, and she mightn't want to be in it." Before she could say any more, Betty catapulted up off the bed. His legs drove him across the room. "Since when have you had a mate?" He grated down at Molly. "You've gone it alone ever since I've known ya." Molly snarled the lips back from her teeth. As sure as God, she almost whispered, "You're mad. There's something crawling on your mind tonight, and I don't want any part of it." She pushed Betty away from her. "Go on, get out of it before I get the dog. He'll rip the soul case out of ya." A tall blonde bent almost double to come in through the tiny doorway. She had her arms in a pale blue kimono, pulling it across her body. Betty stared at her long white legs. "For crying out loud," he said, "where did you come from?" The girl looked from him to Dan, then back again. She put a hand on Molly's shoulder. "You heard her," she said, "and what she says goes. We're mates. What's wrong about that?" Dan whistled softly through his teeth. The small room was hot. He felt the sweat trickle down his back as he elbowed in front of Betty. "They ain't nothin'," he chuckled. "In fact, they's a lot of things that's right." He glanced over her kimonoed body. His hand rested on her arm. "A hell of a lot of things." Betty hit him from behind. The blow cracked onto Dan's ear and spun him across the room. He fell sprawling on Molly's bed, driving his head into the blankets. The blonde girl jumped back through the doorway. She screamed as Molly clawed at Betty's face. Then the blonde girl collapsed in a smother on the floor. Betty had picked up Molly bodily and flung her through the doorway. The two girls fought for breath in a tangle of legs and arms. "Stay out of it," Betty grunted, "and you won't get hurt." He had it coming to him. Dan pressed his face closer into the blankets. He kept it there until his head cleared. An aching pain drummed in his ear. God damn his lousy hide, he thought. A man had it rough when they bred him, Betty, for a brother. Dan slewed away from the bed and staggered to his feet. Betty waited, balancing on his feet. His hard eyes glittered. He edged over towards his brother. "How's it coming?" he said softly. "Can you take another one?" Smack on the other ear. Dan cursed him viciously. "If the old woman had have lived to see ya," he grunted, "she'd have been sorry you was ever foaled. She'd have drowned ya when you was young." He crouched, waiting against the wall. Betty edged closer. Molly crept back into the room. Unseen by Betty, she barefooted quietly towards the bed. The blonde girl knelt in the doorway, clutching the kimono across her breast. Betty lost all sense of feeling. The maggots of hate crawled in his mind. "I'll beat him," he thought, "until he can't stand. Then the girls. Beat the lot of 'em. Then a man will get some peace. Know that he's safe from them splitting on him." He suddenly smashed into Dan, driving him hard up against the wall. Part of the canvas top tore, and Dan's shoulders went out through it. The timbered bottom half plowed into his back. Bent backwards, Dan rammed a knee into Betty's groin, heard him groan as the pain bit into his belly. Then Dan choked. Betty had him round the throat. The room was going black. He sagged slowly, hanging his weight on Betty's arms, then kicked forward madly. Betty went down under the impact, but twisted in his fall. He jerked Dan underneath and crashed him full length on the floor. The brothers heaved and strained, with Betty on top. "Gotcha, you bastard," Betty grunted. "I'll thump your skull till it bleeds." Molly wrestled with the blankets on the bed. She tossed them to one side and groped under the mattress. Her fingers closed on a hard, double-triggered butt. She slid out the gun to its full length of gleaming barrels. Tiptoeing on cautious bare feet, she crept towards Betty's straining back. The blonde girl forgot her kimono as it fell away from her naked front. Her wide eyes stared in disbelief. "Oh God," she thought, "don't let her do it. Let them kill each other if they want to, but don't let Molly pull the trigger." Dan's eyes had turned back in his head. Froth burbled out through his lips. Betty slammed Dan's head once, then felt the icy coldness of metal boring into his backbone. "Get up, Betty," Molly grated. "Get up, or so help me God, I'll pull the trigger, and blast your guts into hell." Betty grinned wolfishly. For a long moment he kept his fingers viced on Dan's windpipe, then eased them away. A shudder vibrated down his back. The madness left his eyes. He felt the gun barrels grating in deeper, scraping skin off bone. Molly jabbed harshly. "Go on," she grated. "Get up, and don't keep me waitin'. My fingers startin' to itch." Betty crawled up to his feet. His body had a great tiredness. Patches of dark sweat stained his shirt. Molly stared at the back of his neck, the bent-over shoulders. "He's right now," she thought. "His brain's comin' back to normal. Funny how some men go." She prodded Betty's sore backbone. "Go on," she said. "Get over there and sit on the bed." Betty stumbled over Dan's outstretched arm. Dan groaned as breath sucked back into his lungs. He forced himself up to a sitting position. The blonde girl came over to put her arm round his shoulders. "Are you right?" she asked. "Or would you like me to get you a drink?" Dan rubbed his aching throat. "That's an idea at that," he grunted. He twisted. "My bloody pipes. A man'll have to see if the grog goes down." The blonde girl looked up at Molly. "How about it?" she said. "Will I bring out a bottle?" Molly nodded her tousled head. She watched Betty as he flopped on the disheveled bed. "Sure," she nodded. "It'll do us all good. Except that mangy cow." She jerked the gun towards Betty. Dan struggled to his feet while he swayed over to sit on an upturned box. The blonde girl went through the tiny door. She came in again with a wine bottle clasped round the neck. Dan rubbed a hand inside his shirt collar and nodded at Molly's gun. "She's right now," he said. "You can put it away. There won't be any more brawlin'." The blonde girl fumbled for a corkscrew, pushing rubbish to one side in a drawer. Molly stared her disbelief at Dan, then across to Betty. "What are you trying to give me?" she asked. "I wouldn't trust him if he sneezed." The blonde girl found the corkscrew. Her kimono slid down when she jerked out the cork. A firm white breast showed its nipple, and she covered it over. "Nor me either," she said. "The way he belted into ya. He's off his flamin' head." Dan watched the girl's hands smooth over the swell of blue material. "No, he ain't," he said. "It's the grog dyin' in him. We've been on it for 4 or 5 days." His bloodshot eyes focused to Molly. "You ought to know you've seen him like this before." Molly rested the gun on her hip. The towel hung in a tight fold. "The hell I have," she said. "I've seen him crook, I'll admit, but never like this. He'd have done ya if I hadn't have prodded him off, taken the gun to him." "Maybe he would," Dan nodded, "and maybe he wouldn't. But it's over now and finished. Let's have a drink and forget it." "I don't know that we will." Molly drank from the glass the blonde girl handed her. She passed it back. "Fill it up for yourself, Lil, and give 'em the bottle." She flicked hair from her eyes. "They like it that way." The girl refilled the glass, holding it against the dim lantern light. The bottle was half empty when she slid it into Dan's hands. He upended it between his teeth and sucked thirstily. Wine dribbled out over his chin. He wiped it and passed the bottle to Betty. Betty took it silently, hunched forward on the edge of the bed. His glance flickered from face to face before he jammed the bottle neck between his teeth. When he set it down, the bottle was empty. He kicked it under the bed. "That's better," he grunted. "Now a man can talk." He looked up slyly at Lil. "So, you think I'm mad," he added softly. Lil lowered her eyelids to stare back at him. Her hands pulled the kimono tighter. "Sure I do," she added. "And so you are mad as a crawlin' snake." She tipped her head back and drained the glass. Betty chuckled deep in his chest. "So long as we know where we stand," he said. "Yeah," Lil said. "That's just where we stand." The room held a sudden quiet tautness. Heat glimmered sweat on the brothers' faces, trickled it down their necks. Molly shifted uneasily on her bare feet. The gun felt heavy. She let its barrel sag towards the floor. "For cryin' on my shoulder," she said. "Someone better say something, or we'll be right where we started." She looked over her shoulder at Lil. "You'd better see if we've got another one. The one we've had didn't go far." Lil was glad to go. She bent almost double as she went through the tiny doorway. The hell, she thought, groping round in the dark. The places a woman gets into. She heard Betty creaking the bed. "All right," she heard him say. "I'll say something. How's it going to be, Molly? If anyone asks ya, are you going to say we've been here since about 7? Lil's hands rested on a heap of bottles. She lifted one and went back into the room. Dan tried to slide his arm round her waist as she went past, but Molly poked the gun at him. "Keep your hands off until you're asked," she said. "Give 'em the bottle, Lil, and that'll keep 'em busy." Betty waited on the bed. The lines on his face had carved deeper. He watched Dan twisting the corkscrew into the cork. "What's it gonna be, Molly?" he said. "I'm waitin' on ya." Molly leaned against the wall and rested the shotgun butt down in between her feet. "You've got a long wait," she said, "unless you tell me what's doin', what it is you've been up to, and why you want us to cover ya." Betty shook his head. "A man couldn't trust ya," he almost whispered. "You'd spill it all over the town." Dan looked up as he set the bottle on the floor. "You're wastin' your bloody breath," he grunted. "They're soon gonna put things together when they go into Yorinda tomorrow. You might as well tell 'em." "Shut up," Betty snarled, "and keep your trap shut. What nobody don't know, they can't prove." He held out a hand. "Give us another drink, and we'll get some sleep." Molly jerked the shotgun up again, holding it in line with Betty's head. "The hell we'll get some sleep," she said, "unless you come clean. Either that or else get out." Lil snatched the bottle from the floor and held it in her hand. "Sure," she nodded, "and that goes for the grog, too. You know some funny people, Molly, but I'm with ya, right along the line." Molly suddenly laughed, quivering the shotgun. "I know some funny ones all right," she chuckled, "but it ain't always like this. You picked a rum go for your first night in my humpy." Lil poured a glassful of wine. "I didn't pick it," she said. "It looks like those two scrappers wished it on us." Dan knocked over the box as he stood up. "Goddamn, they're naked hides," he thought. "They're treating a man like dirt, instead of sweating close to him on a bed." He reached out for the bottle. "Give us a go at it," he said, "and let's get down to business. You both look too good to waste." Molly's hand whitened over the trigger. The knuckles ridged tightly. "These 2 barrels on this shotgun," she grated, "and one of 'em's for you. Now get back there on the box and stay there, or I'll blast your guts through the wall." Dan slumped down slowly. His hands felt behind him and righted the box. He eased onto it. "The hell with this," he said to Betty. "We ain't getting nowhere. Let's get out of it. We better pick up that dough. No sense now. I'm leaving it there." "For crying out loud," Betty grunted. "A man ought to have choked you. You've got a mouth like a river channel." He stood up slowly from the bed. Molly held the gun steady. She felt her heart thumping between her breasts. "You win, Molly," he said softly, "and I wish to Christ you was dead. You ain't got the guts to stick to a man when he's in strife. But you're all right when he's hellin' around, checked up with dough." He took a pace towards the door. Dan pushed up to follow him. Lil sidled close to Molly, her drink forgotten. The room seemed tight with the menace of the 2 men. Molly kept the gun pointed. "I've got the guts all right, Betty," she said, "but there's one thing I can't stomach, and you've got some of it on your sleeve." Bede had his hand on the door hatch. He slewed round viciously, writhing the lips back from his teeth. Dan's body halted rigid. "What's that you said?" Bede hissed. "What was it you said, Molly?" Molly felt fear tear deep inside her. "You heard what I said," she whispered, "and you know what I mean. There's blood on your shirt, and it ain't just from a brawl. Get out before I pull the trigger. The sergeant'd be happy to call it self-defense." Bede sighed a deep breath. He glanced down at his shirt. The bitch, he thought, the naked, scheming bitch. She's got eyes like a hawk, even in this dim light. He hadn't thought about the blood splattering from Old Bill's skull. Bede wrenched open the door. "Come on," he grated, "and let's get out of it before I beat out her brains." He stumbled outside, with Dan treading close behind him. They both cursed vilely as the dog raved madly on its chain. Molly edged towards the door, holding the gun in front of her. She patted softly, splaying her bare toes carefully. The towel again slid down over her hips, and she let it fall. "The hell with it," she thought. "There's other things to worry about." Her legs gleamed whitely as she crouched in the doorway. Lil crept close to her. They stared out into the blackness. The brothers' whispered voices echoed back hollowly from the riverbank. Molly rested the gun on her knees. "They're down near the big knobby gum tree," she said. "Maybe they're thinking of coming back." Lil shuddered her arms across her breast. She pulled the kimono tighter. "It's gonna be crook if they do," she whispered. "How are we gonna keep 'em out?" Molly rested the gun against the door jamb. "I'll give 'em a few more minutes," she said, "and then sneak out for the dog. We'll shut him in here with us for the night." She looked round the room. "They won't get in with him around." Lil stood up to straighten her knees. "Yeah," she nodded. "He may be rough and rowdy, but I'd sooner sleep with him than one of them." Molly laughed as she pulled down her shirt tails. Her feet moved gingerly out over the door sill. "It won't be as bad as that," she chuckled, "but I know what you mean." The darkness swallowed her. Lil sat down and nursed the shotgun. Chapter 6. Rick hunkered back to stare at the sky. In the east, a blood-red haze smudged the dark horizon. The stinker, he thought, the red roasting, balled-up sun of a stinker. Another half hour and a man'll be frying. He reached across the ashes to fill his mug with tea. "A man can smell it burnin'," he said, "before it hits the sky." Mick waited before he answered. His big hands had ripped off a hunk of bread. He wiped it round inside the camp oven. Fat dripped down over his chin when he stuffed the bread in his mouth. "You're always belly achin'," he grunted. "What do you want it to do? Spit icicles on your head?" He gulped a mouthful of tea. "Yeah," Rick nodded. "It'd make a change at that." They squatted silently. Galahs rustled in the drought-twisted tree-tops. A tired fish plopped lazily in the stagnant river. Somewhere to the north, hoofbeats clip-clopped softly. Their dust-muffled drumming whispered through the gum trees. Rick stared out into the half-light. "Joe's comin' now," he said. "You'd better get his steak on. He must have had a long walk. It's taken him a good hour to find 'em." Mick lifted the camp oven onto a heap of glowing coals. When the fat sizzled, he dropped in a big, inch-thick steak. He poked the meat flat with his finger. "She'll be right," he grunted. "That ought to give him something to chew on." The hoofbeats clip-clopped closer. Joe showed through the stark antlered trees. He led 2 horses by their halter leads and rode barebacked on another. Close to the camp, Joe slid to the ground. He rubbed sweaty horsehair from his trousers as he walked towards the fire. The 3 horses trailed behind him. Rick stood up. "I got the gelding for you," Joe said, "and these other 2 for me and Mick." He passed the reins of his bare-backed horse to Rick. Mick took the halter leads and led the horses and tied them to saplings. Joe squatted down by the fire. He had the steak on a plate when he said, "I could eat a bullock whole and pick my teeth with his horns." A man had to walk a good 4 miles. They were feeding on the watercourse over towards Bulla. Mick fitted bridles on the 2 horses. Rick saddled the big gelding. He tested the girths for tightness before he swung onto the high withered back. "I'll get ahead and muster 'em," he said. "You 2 can come along when you're ready." Joe grunted with surprise. His mouth was too full to speak. Mick spat at a stream of ants. They scurried back into their hole. "For floggin' a gin sideways," he said. "Why don't you wait? We won't be more than 10 minutes. Joe's halfway through now." Rick rubbed his rib. It ached every time he moved quickly. The hell, he thought, that bastard must have cracked it. A man's better on his own. He can sweat it out. If he has to do some hard riding, see how he goes. Rick nodded towards Joe. "They ain't no sense in choking him. He's ramming it down with both hands now." "I'll canter on and wheel 'em up to the gate. You 2'll be there before I'm ready to put 'em through." Mick picked up a saddle. "If that's how you want it," he said, "it's Jake by me. We'll see you later somewhere near the gate." He slung the saddle over a horse. Joe nodded. "Yeah," he grunted, "we'll see you then." They watched Rick ride away, his lean behind habitually set to the saddle. Mick bent over to reach for the surcingle. His hand groped under the horse's belly before he found the strap. He slipped the end through its buckle. "You know," he said, "old Rick's a funny cow. Never know what's on his mind." He strained on the surcingle. When it was tight, he buckled it securely, but there's something not right about him. He ain't sittin' easy in the leather. Joe poured another mug of tea. "It's his rib," he said. "That kicking Betty gave him rattled him up some. He's got a lump there as big as an egg. I saw it yesterday when we were swimmin'." Mick carried a saddle over to the next horse. "Yeah," he grunted, "I saw it too. The horse was restive." Mick swore when it laid back its ears. "Get up, you bastard," he added, "or I'll flatten ya," while the horse reared impatiently. Mick clamped on the saddle. Then he slapped the animal's rump. "She's right, Joe. I'm ready when you are. I've got 'em screwed down tight." Joe nodded. He still had half of the steak to eat. In the distance, Rick was difficult to see. His horse had dipped down into a hollow. The old saddle basher, Joe thought. A man'll have to flog some to catch up with him. Joe sank his knife in the steak. Clear of the river bank, gum trees, Rick reined across the vast sweep of Yorenda Common. Gray light merged into the red scarred skyline. Dust already coiled in the first faint swirl of the whirly-whirlies. Rick settled to the saddle, felt the lift of the big gelding pounding beneath him. Its lean, muscled legs drove in a tireless rhythm. Rick slid a hand inside his shirt front. The swollen rib bulged under his touch. "She's right," he thought. The movements Doing it good, taking the ache out of it, numbing it. He patted the gelding's neck. As the miles thudded by, the sun climbed high. It was a molten ball when Rick leaned from the saddle to open a swung iron gate. Urala's 5,000 acres of government reserve land shimmered in front of him. Heat danced its crazy mirages on the encircling horizon. Raining through the gateway, Rick shaded his eyes from the sun glare. A mile or two back, on the twin ribbons of track, dust feathered a drifting trail. Mick and Joe were spurring side by side. Their horses showed big against the miraged sky. Rick pulled his hat low and cantered into the reserve. He found the horses he wanted scattered along a dry watercourse. They flung their startled heads when they saw him, and for a moment trotted helter-skelter. Suddenly they bolted. With streaming manes and tails, they galloped up out of the creek bed towards a distant fence line. Rick reined his horse down long enough to count the wild-eyed herd, then eased the reins through his hands. The big gelding snorted its eagerness. In a flurry of rock-hard, earth-pounding hooves, it drove after the galloping herd. Dust spewed in a cloud over the creek bed. Rick felt the pain stab in his side. He crouched low over the heaving withers. The big gelding's mane whipped back in his face. For cursing all mangy-tailed horses, he thought, why do they have to bolt? A man had them nice and handy. Now he's got to flog the hide off a good horse to wheel them. Rick drove home the spurs. For a cursing, spurring half-mile, he weltered on in a smother of dust. Then he broke clear, and saw the flare-nostriled leaders just ahead of him. He flogged them round with his whip until they streamed towards the gate. "Get over, you bastards," he screamed, "and keep your heads straight. You'd think you'd never seen a man." The pain knifed in his side. Near the gateway, Mick and Joe spurred in to meet him. They steadied the sweaty-necked leaders down to a trot. Mick wheeled his horse to trot ahead in the lead. Joe cantered along to rein in beside Rick. They trotted their horses together, riding knee to knee. Joe looked sideways at Rick's strained gray face. "How are you doing there?" he grunted. "They seemed to be givin' you trouble." Rick stood up in the stirrups as he rubbed a hand on his chin. When he stretched his legs, the pain eased from the rib. He settled back into the saddle. "Trouble is right," he said. "They carved it out for the never, never." Joe nodded. Mick had ridden slowly through the gateway. The gleaming rumped horses snorted through after him. Rick flicked the whip at a straggler. When they were all through, Joe stayed behind to close the gate. He leaned over from the saddle, but his horse fidgeted jumpily. Joe had to dismount. He slammed the gate in a hurry and hooked its latch chain round a post. By the time he caught up with the herd, the excited horses again pounded dustily. Mick cursed every wall-eyed horse plunging in the lead. Rick swore at every straggler trying to break from the rear. Joe listened to their voices. For chasing a gin up a gum tree, he chuckled. "You blokes are bloody good. I've never heard such language." Rick glanced round through slitted eyelids. His hands were knuckled white on the reins. The big gelding plunged beneath him. "Get your arse down and steady 'em," he grunted. "You ain't come along for the ride." He spurred past Joe. Gradually the horses steadied their pace. Sun flamed down on them from a cloudless spread of sky. The heat caked sweat on their backs into smears of muddied dust. Dust rimmed their eyes and coated thick on their nostrils. When the bald-topped gum tree showed its silver bark plainly, the horses whinnied expectantly. Their upflung heads quested towards the stacked pack saddles. They sensed the familiarity of a drover's camp. The months of freedom at Uralla were forgotten. They obeyed the instincts of their training on countless cattle camps. Their hooves shuffled into a restless, fidgeting walk, then stopped close to the stacked saddles. Rick pushed the sweaty hat back from his forehead. "Well, that's that," he said, hoarsely. "It's funny how they go. You give 'em a couple of months' spell, and they think they're brumbies. Then, when you get 'em home, they settle right down quick-like." "Yeah," Mick eased his behind in the saddle. "They ain't much different to a man. He does much the same." Rick rode in among the horses, looking down at their feet. One or two had sand cracks split down the center of their hooves. Others had jagged, overgrown feet, spread flatly on the ground. One had a broken hoof quarter. Blood seeped through into the dust. Rick rode to the outside of the herd again. "Thee's a good bit of work to do," he said, "and they ain't much sense in doing it here. Might as well push 'em along to the stockyards over the bridge." "That's what I thought," Mick nodded. "There won't be any need for one of us to stay mounted and hold 'em. The three of us can work on 'em." Joe rode across to the pack saddles and reached down from the saddle. When he straightened, he clunked a pack bag in front of him on the pommel. "She's right," he said. "I've got the gear. You can set 'em rolling." Rick swung his whip. "Get up there," he grunted, "and take it steady. The next stop's Yorinda." The horses surged away after Mick, jig-jogging along the river bank. As the herd clattered over the bridge, sun gleamed hotly on the stagnant water beneath. The staccato drumming of hooves scared the horses. They plunged forward. When Mick had them steadied again, he looked up to see a black car brake to a stop near the stockyards. "If that's not the sergeant," he thought, "I'm a castrated saddle basher. I wonder what he wants." Mick swung his whip gently and drove the horses from the road. They crowded trampingly towards the stockyards, close to the big timber fence. Mick nodded down at the car. A lined, weathered face peered through the windscreen. "Good day there, Sarge," Mick said. "I ain't seen you around in a long time." The sergeant slid out of the car onto bowed, gaitered legs. His faded pale blue eyes glanced up. "Good day, Mick," he nodded, and walked towards the stockyard gates. "You needn't get down. I'll open 'em for you." He swung back the gates. Mick let the horses run past him into the yard. When the last sweaty rump switched its tail through the gateway, the sergeant closed the gates. He did it slowly, fastening the chain carefully. Rick and Joe rode close. "Good day," they said. The sergeant finished hooking the chain. "Good day," he nodded. "That's a nice lot of horses you've got there. Some of 'em's a bit rough in the feet." He doesn't miss much, Rick thought, and eased down from his saddle. He grunted with pain when his foot touched the ground. The jar jolted his rib. Joe took the bridle reins from him. "You have a yarn with the Sarge," Joe said. "Me and Mick'll carry on with the nags. Trim the hooves on 'em in no time." He led Rick's horse away. For a moment Rick stared after Joe's dusty back. "For crying out loud," he said, "you'd think a man was a cut case. I'll be in there in a minute and give you a hand." He turned round to face the sergeant. "What's doing, Sarge? They been keeping you busy?" He waved towards Yorinda. The sergeant scratched with a hard brown finger. It niggled round his chin, then up the line, grooved deep on his cheek. "Not so you'd notice," he said, "but I keep on pluggin'. Mostly the same old stuff." Rick watched Joe catch a horse. It was the big bay, with the quarter broken on its hoof. They would have to cut it away and paint on some tar. "Yeah," Rick nodded. "I suppose it is. Nothing much really happens around here." Mick had the horse's hoof between his legs and was cutting it with a knife. The sergeant spat through the rails. He liked to watch a bit of horsework. Used to do it himself when he was a trooper, with a horse instead of a car. He wondered how much Rick, or either of the other two, knew. "Ah, I wouldn't say that," the sergeant said. "She's a lively little town sometimes. You can buy a fight quicker than a feed." "Yeah, but a fight ain't much." Rick leaned his arms on the stockyard rails. He half poked his head through. "Hey, Mick," he called, "don't cut too deep. You only want to nick off a little." Mick screwed round to glare over his shoulder. Sweat trickled down through the dust on his face. "Who's doing the bloody job?" he grunted. "Me or you? You keep on with your flamin' maggin'. Me and Joe can look after things here." He bent back over the hoof. Joe passed him a tar tin. He scooped a finger and smeared tar round the jagged hoof wound. The sergeant leaned a shoulder against the rails. "It depends on the fight," he said, "and what happens afterwards. A brawl often leads to some real strife." Rick nodded. "I suppose you're right at that," he said. Joe caught another horse. Mick walked round it, staring down at its feet. A car roared past in the roadway, coming in from across the plains. It slewed round 100 yards past the stockyards into the long main street. The sergeant made a note of its number. He hadn't seen the car before. His fingers tapped on the notebook when he said, "I'm right, all right. And there's something I want to ask you, Rick. Where were you fellers last night?" Rick tipped back his hat. For crying out loud, he thought. Why doesn't he go away? There's a lot of work to do in the yard. A man can't stop here with him all day. Rick rubbed a hand on his chin. "That ain't hard to tell you," he said. "We were in camp, had an early night, so we could get away early. After these bang tails." He nodded at the horses. The sergeant opened and closed the notebook, then slid it into a pocket. "The hell," he thought, "a man's wasting his time. There isn't one of them that would do it. They don't come any straighter." He pushed away from the rails. "Are you sure of that?" he said. Rick, too, straightened up from the rails. He stared down at the sergeant. "What are you trying to give me?" he grated. "If you doubt what a man says, don't ask any bloody questions." Anyway, without a warrant or something like that, you ain't got any more rights than the next man." The sergeant creased his lined face. "The hell I haven't," he chuckled. "But we'll let it pass. You're too hot under the saddle." His face tightened. The sun-faded eyes stared back into Rick's. "Maybe I'd better tell ya. Bill Bates was murdered last night, and I'm checking every man. Every man, that is," he added, "who knew him." Rick felt his chin sag. "He's what?" he said. "How the hell did that happen? Who'd be mongrel enough to murder old Bill?" He thought of the Dennis brothers. The sergeant scratched his chin. "Who would be?" he grunted. "But somebody did." He watched Mick's big-chested body coming toward the rails. Joe, bow-legged behind, leading a horse. Mick bent his head down to peer between the rails. He wiped the sweaty dust from his mouth. "Say that again," he said softly. "You wouldn't be having us on, would ya?" Joe spat thoughtfully, watching the spittle ball over in the dust. "No," he said, "I don't think he is." The sergeant hitched his belt. "Nope," he said flatly. "That's how it stands. Somebody's murdered the old coot, and I ain't got much to go on." He shrugged his shoulders. "But that's the way it is. It's always like that at the start." Rick felt at a loss. He glanced from Mick to Joe, then to the sergeant's quizzical face. What can a man say, Rick thought. He doesn't know who did actually do it, only guess, and a damned good guess at that. But guessing finds no place with the law. He rubbed a hand on his chin. "How was old Bill when you found him?" he asked. "Did he have any money on him?" The sergeant shook his head. "No," he said, "not a red penny." Mick crossed his arms on a rail and rested his chest on them. "But I suppose you know what he did have on him. At least," he added, "that is before he was knocked off." "Sure I do." The sergeant walked over to the car to ease his behind down on a mudguard. "And I know all about the brawl you had with the Dennis brothers." He jerked his chin towards Rick. "In fact, I know a lot of things. But," he shrugged his shoulders, "you don't know who did it." Joe leaned on the rail beside Mick. The horse he led pulled back on the bridle reins. Joe cursed it. The sergeant nodded. "That's one of 'em," he said, "and the ones or two things besides." He glanced across at the three faces, the main one of which is I can't find the Dennis brothers. Joe spat over the rail. Mick straightened up to push back his hat. Rick fingered the swelling on his sore rib. "Oh ho," they thought. "So that's how it is. The old squint-eyed hunting dog. He's got his nose pointed right." Rick slowly nodded his head. "You think they might be able to help ya? Maybe give ya some sort of a lead?" The sergeant slid round to open the car door. He was almost behind the wheel when he said, "Something like that. A man never knows his luck." He slammed the door. Rick rubbed a hand on his chin. "Luck is right," he grunted. "I hope you have plenty of it." The sergeant started the motor and slipped in a gear. "So long," he nodded. "I'll be seeing ya." The car rolled forward. An arm waved as it went past. Rick stepped aside from the dust. "So long," he said. Mick crawled out through the rails to stand beside Rick. They stared after the swirling dust clouds as the sergeant drove over the bridge. Away from Yorinda, they saw the car swerve leftwards, following a track winding downriver. Gradually, the big gum trees cut it off from sight. Mick turned to lean on the fence. "Can you beat it?" he said. "Old Bill dead. You wouldn't credit it, would ya?" Joe slipped the bridle from the horse before he climbed through the rails. "Don't get cryin' in your milk," he said, when he stood up straight. "A man gets it when it's comin', and he won't dodge it." He thought for a moment, hissing softly through his teeth, but maybe he would have dodged it if he'd have banked that 400 quid. "He surely would at that," Rick nodded. He watched the horses stamping restlessly in the stockyard. An iron-gray gelding kicked viciously at a mare. She wheeled and lashed out with both heels. Her hooves drummed on the gelding's belly. He trotted away, doubled up. Rick swore at both of them. Then he said, "I don't know about you fellers, but I could do with a drink. A man's too dry to spit." He jerked a thumb towards the horses. "They'll be right for a bit. Won't hurt 'em to stand for an hour or two." Mick shaded his eyes to glance at the sun. "Yeah," he said, "I'll be in that too. We've had a fair bloody mornin' of it." Joe spat in the dust as their boots scuffed towards the road. "There's one thing about it," he grunted. "We have had a bloody mornin', which is more than old Bill has." "Who's cryin' now?" Mick wanted to know. They walked on in silence. Going past Dawes' office, they noticed the door was shut. A heavy padlock hung on the rusty bolt. "He must be out of town," Rick said. Mick barely glanced at the door. "The hell with Dawes," he thought. "A man wants a drink, not a yarn about the weather and the troubles of droving bullocks." He hooked a thumb in his belt. Near Jones' Cafe, Rick broke the silence again. "How about some tea?" he said, "and a bit of tucker to go with it." Mick jabbed the thumb deeper, pushing the belt lower on his hips. "To hell with the bloody tea," he grunted. "A man needs something stronger." He looked in through the window as he went past. Joan was bent over a table, smoothing a cloth. "Maybe we will later, after we've had a drink. I ain't never met the little filly. She looks sort of nice and neat." "She is at that," Rick nodded. "How about you, Joe? Is that Jake with you?" Joe shrugged. "I'm easy, so long as it's something wet. A man can tucker up afterwards." Inside the Ronde, the barroom vibrated with murmured argument. Men leaned over to talk in close-headed discussion. Sweaty shoulders jerked as their owners drove home points. One or two of the dozen or more men turned to nod. One came across to shake hands with Rick. "She was a good go the other night," he hiccuped. When he turned to walk away, he stumbled over his spurs. The rowels caught in his trousers leg. Joe stared at the man's swaying back and spat in the sawdust. "He's full as a boot," he said. Mick slapped a hand on the bar. For every flogging barman, he thought, there ought to be a law. They should be drowned in their own beer, then hung out in the sun to dry, as a warning to all men. Mick felt his throat filling. Maybe he should have stuck with old Bill, forced him to go out to the camp. The barman bellied close, ramming his paunch on the mahogany. His glance flickered from Rick to Mick and Joe. "How are you there, fellers?" he said. "She's been a wild night." They clobbered up your mate. The three stared across at him. Sweat lined the dust masked on their faces. For a moment Mick clenched his hand. When he opened it, the hand shook. "You see how it is," he almost whispered. "A man wants to hit something, and maybe it ought to be you." The barman eased slowly backwards. "The crazy saddle bashers," he thought. "They get a mate cracked on the skull, and they want to hit a man." He fumbled under the bar for some glasses. "What's rubbin' ya under the shirt collar?" he grunted. "It's nothin' to do with me. I didn't knock ya flamin' mate." "No, I don't suppose you did," Mick nodded. "You wouldn't have the guts, but you was tangled in it some ways. I'll bet my oath on that." He jerked a note from his pocket. "Come on, fill 'em up, and turn one down for Bill. That's all we've come in for." Joe pushed back his dusty hat. Rick rubbed a hand on his chin. "That's right," they said. The barman slid all three full glasses, then downturned an empty one next to them. Mick backhanded it from the bar. The barman ducked as the glass smashed behind him. "Do it right," Mick grated, "or so help me." "God, I'll smash the lot in your face." The barman reached for another glass. "You're mad," he said. "Mad as a team of snakes." He filled up the glass. "Maybe I am," Mick said. His fingers closed round a glass. Rick and Joe raised theirs. "All right," Mick nodded. "Over with it, and wish 'em luck as you do it." The barman overturned the glass. Beer spread in a frothy amber puddle, then trickled down onto the sawdust. Mick raised his glass. "Here's all the best," he said. The three drank. When they smashed their glasses on the floor, the hotel's owner came in. His worried eyes stared through lids of puckered fat. "What's going on?" he said. Mick flung the note on the bar and watched beer soak into the paper. "She's right," he said. "They ain't nothin' wrong, and that'll pay for the damage." The three swung away towards the door. In the room's sudden silence, their boot heels echoed on the floor. They shouldered out into the main street. Glare blinded in from the road. Under the awning, heat stifled in the shade. Rick squinted his dust-sore eyes. "You know," he said, "the barman was right. We're mad as bloody snakes." Joe walked, bow-legged, to the gutter. His glance wandered down the street to the other side of the road. The Stockman's Hotel stood in the sun-faded drabness. Joe spat in the gutter. "Aw, I dunno," he grunted. Mick did the right thing. A man has to show something, some way. He leaned against a post. Yeah, that's what I thought," Mick nodded. "There's not much a man can do." He looked round at Rick. "I reckon I buggered ya drink." "The hell you did," Rick said. "I'm with ya all along. It's just the way it struck me." "Struck ya is right," Joe agreed. He watched a horseman riding towards them. It was Jeb Hunt, a local horse-breaker. Before he drew close, Jeb reined round to the rear of the Stockmans. "Let's go down there." Joe nodded across the road. "And get a drink. A man might fancy it better." Mick shook his head. "No," he grunted. "The way I feel now, I'd get stone motherless drunk, and that ain't no use. We've got those horses to do." Joe pushed away from the post. "Sure, I was forgettin' about them." He set his hat straight. "Let's get back and finish 'em." "We'll have some tucker first," Rick said. On their heel-rocking way to Joan's Cafe, Mick said, "You know, he wasn't really a mate, but it somehow sticks in your gills. He was a decent old codger, kind sort of bloke." "He was at that," Joe nodded. "They don't come any better. You could trust 'em anywhere with a horse. He'd never knock 'em about." Rick listened to their talk. He pulled his hat brim low over his eyes. They're funny cows, he thought, rough as cement and twice as hard, but they crack just the same. Old Bill getting killed has really rocked them, me too for that matter, in a stampede, or on a young horse. Anything can happen. A man is always more or less prepared for accidents, but when an old man like Bill is murdered, it comes as a shock. Rick slid a hand on his aching rib. "He was a kind old bloke, all right," he said, "and there's no doubt who did it. I don't think there's anybody else who knocks around in the mob here," he jerked his thumb, "who'd be low enough to do it. And it's a funny thing. We still don't know how it was done and where it was done." Mick spat on the pavement. "What does it matter?" he grunted. "He's dead, and that's the main thing. Knowing where he caught it won't help us, or either." "You're right at that," Joe nodded. "We ain't the flamin' police. A man can't poke his nose in. He'd have the ol' sergeant on his tail if he did. We'll find out soon enough." "Yeah," Mick said, "but there's one side to it we can look out for. We may bump into Betty and Dan before the sergeant does. I don't reckon he'd mind if they had a strip or two of hide ripped off 'em." Rick rubbed his sore rib. "I don't reckon he would." At that he grunted. Outside Joan's Cafe, Joe tucked in his shirt. Mick hitched his belt, setting the buckle dead over his navel. Rick tipped back his hat. When he opened the door, a bell clanged close to his ear. He ducked instinctively. "For crying out loud," he said, "you'd think it was a buck jumper slammin' a bell in your ear." He looked up to see Joan smilin' at him. Cups littered the counter in front of her. Her hands were busy underneath. "Good day," Rick nodded. Joan wiped the suds from her hands as she came round the counter. "Good day," she smiled. "I'm glad you've come again, and brought some friends." She smiled at Mick and Joe. "My tea couldn't have been too bad after all." Although the girl was smiling, the three noticed her eyes. They had strained lines, puckered between the brows. "She's heard about the murder," they thought. "It's got her tied up inside, enough to knot anyone's stomach when a man gets killed just a few doors along the street." Joe rolled over towards a table. Mick followed him. Rick stared down at Joan. "Yeah," he said, "it was good all right." He pulled the hat from his head and pointed with it. "That's Joe just sittin' down, and the other one's Mick. The two mates I think I told you about." Joe bobbed his head. Mick jerked off his hat. "How are ya?" they grunted. The chair creaked when Mick eased his bulk into it. The sweaty spread of his shirt bulged on either side. Joe elbowed forward on the table. He looked round the cafe when he said, "Nice place you got here. Nice and clean. Bit different to when old Miss Higgins had it." Joe chuckled. "That's what he said." She smiled and nodded at Rick. When he first came in, "It's nice to know I've made some improvement. It was pretty dirty," she said. Well, Rick stalked over to the table and sat down. His spurs scraped as he stretched his long legs. The hell, he thought, a man's ripping up the floorboards. He ought to be out in the scrub, sitting by a campfire. He slid his hat under his chair. We reckoned we could do with some tucker. Save us going out to the camp and getting a feed for ourselves. What would you like? Joe leaned backwards when Joan smoothed the cloth. Mick felt conscious of her nearness. He hid his dust-brown hands between his knees. Rick stared towards the window. "Ham and eggs," they said, while Joan whisked knives, plates, and forks on the table. The three sat immovable. Joan flickered round their rigid shoulders. Goodness, she thought, they're the shyest men I've known, and by the look of them, just about the toughest. I shouldn't like to be a man and argue with them. She set a cruet in the table's middle. "There," she said, "now it's all ready. I shan't be long frying the eggs." She swirled away towards the kitchen. Mick and Joe looked after her. Mick rubbed the dust from his eyes. "God damn it to hell," he grunted. "But she's some filly. A man can smell the soap on her." "That ain't soap," Joe said. "It's perfume." He lidded over an eye, turning to Rick. "Shows you how much he knows. Give him a yard full of horses, and he's right. But put him among the ladies, and he can't tell scent from soap." "Yeah," Rick nodded. "He used to be a camel teamster. That buggered up his nose." Joan was flushed when she brought in a loaded tray. Little beads of moisture clung to her face. She felt the dampness on the back of her neck. Phew, she thought. It certainly is hot, especially out in the kitchen. Over the stove. She set the plates on the table. "There you are," she said. "I think that's everything. I'll make the tea now." She took away the tray. The three ate quickly. Force of habit made them bolt the meal down with great gulps of tea. Joan pretended to be busy, but watched, fascinated. Her eyes rounded when Mick pushed away his plate and said he'd like some more. They rounded still wider when Joe did the same. "He's only half as big as the other one," she thought, "but his appetite is just the same." "Leave me out of it," Rick said. "I've had all I can take." The belt's straining at the buckle. "You got a gut like a racehorse," Joe started to say. He choked it short with a grunt. Mick's boot had cracked up against his shin. Joan heard the crack as she came across, but could see no movement. Her glance wandered round the three sweat-grimed faces. "That's funny," she thought. "I'm sure I heard something. Sounded like a kick." She picked up the plates. When she was safely through the kitchen, Joe scowled at Mick. "Christ," he whispered, "what the hell are you doing? You bloody near broke my leg." Mick jerked an anxious head. "Keep your flappin' trap shut," he mumbled. "Can't you see where the hell we are? She ain't no riverside heifer, ready for the first bloody bull." Rick spluttered a mouthful of tea. The back of his hand glistened wetly. After he wiped it across his chin, "For crying out loud," he said, "we should have gone back to the camp. You're like two flamin' crows, quarrelin' over their tucker. Why don't you take a tumble, get a bit of sense into your skulls?" Joe buttered a slice of bread. Half was in his mouth when he grinned. "Take a tumble is right, The cow wouldn't know how to spit unless you told him. He rammed in the rest of the slice. Mick sprawled back in his chair. I wouldn't say that, he grunted. I can hit an ant on the run. Maybe you'd like me to show ya. Joe squinted over his cup top. He wanted to wash the bread down. Who don't know now, he said, where the so and so hell he is. He drained the cup. When Joan came in from the kitchen, she felt hotter than ever. As she set down the tray, a car roared past in the roadway. Dust billowed up in the harsh red glare and swirled in under the awning. Joan glanced at the window, already coated with dust. She watched another film spread thickly over it. I clean it twice a day, she said, but it doesn't make much difference. 1 or 2 cars go past, and it's as bad as ever. Rick pushed backwards in his chair to stare at the window. He had a hand clutched round the cup. The brown fingers dwarfed it. Yeah, he nodded. She's all sun and dust. You'll remember me tellin' you that. She's a hard country for women. Y'all do well if you stick it for a month or 2. He drank from the cup. That was the sergeant, he went on, just gone past in his car. I reckon he's goin' back to the Ronde. Joan wisped the hair away from her face as she picked up the tray. Mick forked in a mouthful of ham. Joe dunked bread in an egg. Joan stood close to Rick. Yes, she said, that was a dreadful thing to happen. He was such a nice old man. Mick stopped the fork halfway to his mouth. Did you know him? He said. He wasn't the sort to come into this sort of place. He waved the fork round towards the room. Joan tucked the tray under her arm. She fumbled with the apron tied tightly round her waist. Yes, she nodded. He came in here several times after Mr. Dawes brought him in for the first time. Monday, I think it was. He'd been drinking heavily. Mr. Dawes was trying to make him sober. I made him some strong black coffee, but he wouldn't drink it. Said he wanted tea. She smoothed down the apron. So he had that, with ham and eggs. Joe pushed away his plate. That'd be Old Bill, he said. He'd stay with the tea till the last. He shrugged his shoulders. You don't want to worry about it, miss. Just try and forget it. It's the sort of thing that could happen anywhere. Only in a small town like Yorinda, it seems kinda close. He leaned back in his chair. The hell, he thought. Who am I trying to kid? She's scared out of her petticoats. If a man could put an arm round her waist, he might steady her down a bit, but he'd have Buckley's chance. It'd be like a bull camel rubbing up against a thoroughbred filly. Joe glanced up at Joan's lovely face. You know what I mean, he added. You want to take it easy, not let it get you down. Mick thought the same things. His big fingers felt for the note fold in his pocket. When Joan took the tray across to the counter, he slipped 2 sweaty notes under the plate. The other 2 watched him. Rick rubbed a hand down his chin. Joe nodded agreement. Yeah, Mick drawled. You don't want to let it worry ya. It's part of the stinkin' place. When it gets a bit too rough, you'll want to pull out. Catch the first mail van back to Sydney. Joan felt the kindness in their voices. I've never quite met men like them, she thought. It's very true what Mr. Dawes said about them. She tried to remember his exact words. The memory evaded her for a moment. She stacked the crockery on the counter. No, she smiled. I'm not going to pull out, as you call it. If other people can live here, so can I. Murders happen in Sydney, you know, she added. Rick felt for the hat under his chair. That's the way it goes, he thought. She'll battle on till her heart's broken. The heat'll send her round the bend. The dust'll grit into her soul case. Then she'll pull out. He grated the chair back and stood on his feet. The other two scraped up too. Yeah, Rick said. You've got what it takes, all right. Your mum sure bred a good 'un. His spurs scraped as he walked towards the door. So long, Joan. The money's on the table. He jerked a thumb. Joan's flushed face smiled over the counter. She brushed away a wisp of hair. Her eyes watched the 3 sets of dusty shoulders crowding out the door. So long, she said, and thanks very much. I hope I shall see you some more. Mick was the last one through the doorway. He held the door open with his elbow. You will, he grunted, and went out onto the street. Joan stayed behind the counter. She felt the warmth flooding into her eyes. It's funny, she thought, how close you can get to tears, because you know somebody is kind. She picked up the tray. The table had to be cleared. Outside, on the heat-cracked pavement, Rick pulled the hat low over his dust-seamed face. Mick and Joe, bow-legged on either side of him, as they swung towards the stockyards. You know, Mick said, that's one hell of a girl. Pretty as they come, and a ton of guts. You don't often get the two together. He hooked a thumb in his belt. Rick nodded. He's right, he thought. Old Mick is stone, motherless right. She's one of those girls a man will always remember. You want to touch her with your hands, put your arms round her, but you can't. A man has to go it alone. Flog it out in the sun glare. Spit the dust from his gummed-up lips and feel the sweat in his shirt. He rubbed a hand down his chin. You're right at that, he said. She's all wool and a yard wide. Joe nodded silently. They heel-rocked on. Near the stockyards, dust hung thick on the air. The restless horses churned around in a drifting smother. Tangled manes shook as heads tossed in a whinnying welcome. Mick spat through the rails, his voice the thought of the others. This is where a man belongs, he said, in there amongst the bloody horse dung. Rick creased a twisted grin. I guess that hits the nail, he nodded. Fair on the bloody head. A man's had too much of it on his boots to ever get away. He bent over to crawl through the rails. Pain stabbed in his rib. He felt Joe's hand pulling on his shoulder. Don't give us that, Joe grunted. You got a rib like a busted drum. Go round through the gate and take it easy. Me and Mick can do the work. You can hold the flamin' nags. They worked through the long afternoon. Rick caught and held the rearing, plunging horses. Mick and Joe sweated with cursing violence under the animals' lean, gutted bellies. Mick chopped away broken hoof horn. Joe rasped the hooves to a rounded smoothness. As each horse was finished, they slapped its rump into the next yard. When the last horse snorted at the end of its bridle reins, the sun angled in through the rails. The horse was a staring-eyed gelding. Mick walked tiredly round it to examine its feet first, then slid a hand down its hip to pick up a hind leg. The brute lashed out, driving its hoof into Mick's doubled-up stomach. He rocked under the impact. "You rotten bastard," he grunted. "A man ought to split ya skull. Drive a bloody chopper right between ya eyes." He doubled over. Joe pulled Mick away from the gelding. "Give us a go at 'em," he said. Sweat trickled down his face. He scooped it off with a dust-grimed hand. "A man's gettin' cold standin' here. Give ya a chance to get ya wind." "Give ya a go be buggered." Mick slammed Joe out of the way. He caught the horse round its hock and jerked the leg up. "I'll tear the bloody thing off. Never mind me flamin' wind." Joe chuckled hoarsely. He tried to spit, but the dust clung to his mouth. "You're a character," he said. "A man tries to help ya, and ya slam 'em in the ribs." He winked up at Rick. "I'll bet his guts are churnin'. Got a bruise on 'em as big as a plate." Rick held the big gelding steady. Its jaws chomped on the bridle bits close to his hand. "I'll bet he has it that," he grunted. "This mangy sod always was a dog. You remember when we broke 'em? He damn near busted ya leg, rubbin' ya against a fence." Joe watched Mick shift to another hoof. "The hell," he thought, "I remember him all right. He tried everything in the pack. Tried his best to kill a man." Joe slapped dust from his trousers with the rasp. "Sure I do," he said. "Me leg wouldn't come straight for a week. He's a dirty cow all right." When Mick straightened, after trimming all 4 hooves, Joe bent over with the rasp. In a matter of minutes, he wrestled each hoof between his knees and rasped it. He grunted when he dropped the final hoof to the ground. "There you are," he nodded. "That's the last of the hairy goats. You can take 'em away and hang 'em. Do what you like with 'em." Rick unbridled the big-boned gelding and watched it plunge away. "That's that," he thought. "Another job over and another kick in the guts. Mick'll be sore for a week, but he won't say a word. That's the way it goes." Rick hawked a mouthful of dust. "You know," he said, "that wasn't a bad day's work. 31 horses, yarded and hoof-trimmed." Mick walked over to lean on a rail. He could feel the bruise on his knotted belly muscles. "Wasn't bad is right," he grunted. "We did 'em pretty well. That gives us over 60 head. When we box 'em with the others, we're ready any time to pick up the cattle." "That's what I thought," Rick nodded. "We'll run 'em out now. Give 'em time to settle down together. That way we can keep an eye on 'em while we're havin' a spell." He slung the bridle over his shoulder. Joe had his trousers down, one hand tucked in his sweaty shirt under his crutch. The other groped for the trousers. He stared slit-eyed at Rick. "For crying out loud," he said. "Did you say spell? She's a funny bloody spell." He jigged his behind, buttoning up the trousers. "And a rum flamin' go. You got to knock off work to work." Rick opened the gates to get the saddle horses. Mick followed him. They had their horses unhitched from the fence when Rick said, "You ought to be used to it. We've been doing it long enough."